Hi, I'm Dr. Sean Robinson, and I teach botany here at SUNY Oneonta. The goal of this video is to provide a brief introduction to some of the common edible and utilitarian plants that grow here in central New York. In addition, I'm going to provide examples from different taxonomic groups of plants in order to provide you with some botanical knowledge, if you will. Before we go out on a walk and start looking at some plants, however, I do have a few disclaimers. The first is to make sure that you don't just go out and start eating plants. It's really important that you do your homework first. Either study up on how to identify the plants that you're interested in looking for, or go out with somebody who knows how to identify these plants already and ask them to teach you. It's really not hard to learn how to identify most of these plants, so if you do a little homework, you should be all set. The second thing is to make sure that if you go out with the purpose of harvesting plants, that you do it in a sustainable way, making sure that you have as little impact as possible. So some things to think about before you harvest any plants. When you go out, if you find the plant that you're interested in and it's a very small population of plants or sort of unhealthy looking population, it's best to leave it alone. Look for larger populations that are nice and healthy. When you find that nice and healthy population, make sure that you spread your collecting, meaning that if you're interested in collecting the leaves of the plant or the flowers of the plant or the very top shoots of the plant, don't do all your collecting from just a couple plants. Spread that collecting out across the population. Take a few leaves from this plant and a few leaves from this plant and a few leaves from this plant. That will help you lessen your impact. The last sort of disclaimer is to make sure that whatever plant you're interested in is not a protected plant. There are a lot of plants that are protected due to the fact that they are very uncommon or rare. And the best way to determine whether or not your plant is uncommon or rare and therefore protected is to go to the New York Natural Heritage Program's website. The New York Natural Heritage Program, amongst other things, keeps a tally, or I should say keeps tabs on uncommon and rare organisms that occur in our state. And if you go to their website, you can take a look at or even download a PDF of the rare plant status list. Take a look at that list. If your plant is on that list, you should leave it alone, okay? There's a reason it's on that list, and then there's a reason that it is protected. In addition, as a last sort of piece of information, I encourage you to check out the New York Flora Atlas. The New York Flora Atlas is an incredible resource that is maintained by the New York Floral Association. And by the way, you should check them out too, right? So the New York Flora Association is an incredible organization that if you are interested in botany and you live in New York State, you should definitely check them out. Their whole mission really is to disseminate botanical knowledge, and in addition to having a newsletter, they also have regular workshops on plant identification. So again, check them out. In addition, like I have already mentioned, they maintain the New York Flora Atlas. And if you just Google that, it's one of the first things that will show up. And the New York Flora Atlas is an incredible resource that not only provides a comprehensive list of the vascular plants that grow in each county of the state, but it also provides additional information about those plants. So for example, if your plant, right, is on the rare plant status list, it'll tell you, right? So it gives you the status of each individual species. It also can sometimes provide information about what habitat it grows in. Sometimes there's photographs. Sometimes there's information about how to identify the plant. So definitely check that out. Okay? So with that said, let's go for a walk and take a look at some plants. So trees. Trees are a type of plant from which we can get a lot of things. And in general, we divide trees up into two groups: the hardwoods and the softwoods. Now, taxonomically speaking, hardwood trees are flowering plants. They are what we call angiosperms, and softwood trees are what we call gymnosperms. Now, angiosperms, as a flowering plant, also produce fruit. The name angiosperm actually means vessel or case and seed. So what it means is that the seed is encased in some sort of case or vessel, which we call fruit. Now, the fruit of many trees are things that most people know about, right? So apple trees, for instance, and then there are other ones like hickories and butternuts, beech nuts. We can eat the acorns from oak trees. So there's lots and lots of examples of fruits that we can eat from trees, and most people know that. What you might not know is that there are other things that we can get from these trees. So what I have here is a beautiful yellow birch tree. This is Betula alleghaniensis. And of course we have other birch trees that grow in our region. We have the white birch as well as gray birch. And in addition to fruits, these plants obviously produce other things like wood that we can use. And again, that's something that most people know. But what you don't know, or might not know, is that we can also eat from this tree here the twigs and the leaves. The twigs and the leaves, you can actually steep them in hot water to make a really nice tea, along with the inner bark. Not the outer bark, okay? So you'd have to peel back to get to the inside. And yes, that's not good to do to a living tree. So make sure that if you ever harvest the inner bark of a tree, that you do it from one that has fallen down in a storm or had to be cut down for some reason. And of course, birch trees typically will lose their branches in storms. So you can pick up a branch. This is a rather old branch, so I wouldn't suggest this one. But if a young branch falls off, right, you can then peel the bark away to get to that inner bark. And that inner bark can also, along with the twigs and the leaves, be steeped to make a nice tea. In addition to that, you can dry that inner bark, grind it up, and actually make a nice flour from it as well. So this is a big and beautiful example of a gymnosperm. This is a white pine, or Pinus strobus, and it's an extremely common tree in our forests, and it's very easy to identify. The way to identify it is to take a look at the needles, and all pines produce their needles in clusters, but white pines produce their needles in clusters of 5. And they always say it's easy to remember that because the word white has 5 letters, right? And then again, the clusters of needles are in the number 5. So in addition to that, the pine cones, let me pick up a pine cone here real quick. The pine cones are quite large in terms of length, and they're not super wide, but they are nice and long. And they have resin on the outside that dries this nice white color. So that's another way in that you can actually tell that we have a white pine tree here. Now, as a gymnosperm, these guys don't produce fruit. That's what the name gymnosperm means. If you translate it, it means naked seed. And by naked, we mean that it's not in a vessel or a case or a fruit. Okay, so these guys don't produce fruits. They just produce seeds that are quote-unquote naked. The seeds are edible. They're quite small, and I think collecting and eating seeds from a white pine would be a lot of work for what they're actually worth in terms of what you're getting out of it. But they are edible, and they don't taste too bad at all. But just like our birch tree, you can eat the inner bark of these guys. You can, again, you would have to peel back this outer bark. You don't want to eat the outer bark. It's the inner bark that you want. And you don't want to take it, obviously, from a live tree because that's going to injure the tree. So again, take it from a tree that has fallen recently or from a limb or something like that that has come off in a storm. If you harvest that inner bark, you can dry it, grind it up, and make a flour out of it. As a little piece of information, the word actually Adirondack is thought to have been derived from a Mohawk term which means bark eater or tree eater, and apparently it was a derogatory term that the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people used to call the Algonquin people who used to eat the inner bark of white pine trees as well as other trees. One other thing that I didn't mention when I was taking a look at the birch is the fact that you can actually tap birch trees just like you tap a sugar maple and actually drink that sap. You can drink the sap directly. It's kind of a mildly sweet, nice, refreshing drink. Or you can actually make a beer Most people have heard of birch beer before, or you can actually make a wine from it as well. So there are lots of things that we can get from these trees that most people don't recognize. The last point that I'll make in terms of something that you can get from this guy right here is that if I take these needles and I steep them in some hot water, you can make a tea from them, and it's actually very high in vitamin C. So if you have scurvy, find yourself a white pine tree and make a nice tea, and you'll be all set. Now, another really common weed that we all know is the dandelion, which is in the genus Taraxacum. But to discard a dandelion as simply a weed is really sort of criminal because of the many, many uses that this plant has. In fact, it was brought here from Europe by settlers because of its many uses. For starters, the leaves of this plant are the first greens that come up in the spring that you can eat. So you can eat these in a salad. They're quite good, and you can also cook them into something like a stir fry. The roots can be eaten like a root vegetable, but you can also peel them, dry them, chop them up, and then roast them, and finally grind them into a powder to make a coffee. It's a decaffeinated coffee, but a good coffee. It's a little bitter, but I think it's pretty good. And then the top part, which is obviously our inflorescence or the flower part, is used to make things like dandelion wine. So it's a really, really versatile plant that sort of gets a bad rap and just discarded as a weed, and it really shouldn't. This is Japanese knotweed, and this is a terribly invasive plant which grows along stream sides and in disturbed rocky soils. But it is a plant that you can eat. And because of that, I recommend that you go ahead and harvest as much of this plant as you want because of the fact that it is very invasive. So what part can you eat? Well, what you want to harvest from it are new shoots. So when it comes up out of the ground, the kind of top portion that's coming out, but even after it starts to branch and produce a lot of leaves, you can harvest, again, the growing tip, so the young part of it. You want to remove the leaves, soak the stalks, and then from there you can cook them up. And some people describe the flavor as being very similar to rhubarb, which I think is a really good comparison. So basically you can use it as a replacement for rhubarb. So if you want to make strawberry rhubarb pie, you can make strawberry knotweed pie instead, or make a strawberry knotweed jam or jelly. You can have a nice tasty treat and feel good that you're doing something to help get rid of an invasive plant. So I've given you some examples of edible and / utilitarian angiosperms and gymnosperms, but what about lycophytes and ferns? Well, lycophytes and ferns are what we call the seedless vascular plants. So like gymnosperms and angiosperms, they have vascular tissue being that internal water and sugar conducting tissue that we refer to as xylem and phloem, but they do not produce seeds. So the question is, do these plants have anything to offer us? And the answer is, well, yes, they do. So in the spring, the early spring, when ferns are starting to produce new fronds, they produce those fronds in a sort of coiled up structure that we call a fiddlehead. And those fiddleheads are actually edible. Now, recognize that not all fern fiddleheads are edible. Okay, many of them are actually carcinogenic and are downright dangerous to eat. This is an example of one you don't want to eat. This is a type of wood fern here. But the classic fern from which you can eat the fiddleheads is ostrich fern. An ostrich fern is a very tall fern. They get about yay high, and they tend to grow in moist woodlands and along streams and so forth. So if you find a population of ostrich fern, again, early in the summer or in the sort of late spring, when those fiddleheads are appearing, you can harvest those, but make sure that you cook them thoroughly, okay? You want to boil them, or you can cook them up in a saucepan, but it's important not to eat them raw. There have been people who have had a bad reaction to them when eaten raw, but when they're cooked, they're perfectly fine to eat. When you're harvesting them though, and this is another important point to make, this is a plant that you want to be careful with in terms of how much you harvest. So from each individual plant, you do not want to harvest any more than say 40 to 50% of the fiddleheads that it is producing. Otherwise, you risk killing that plant. Okay, so this little guy right here is what we call a Lycophyte. This particular species is Lycopodium clavidum, and you can see it sort of growing along the ground here, and a lot of people call it club moss because it does sort of look like a moss. And they will produce, I picked it off here for you, but they'll produce these little stalks with strobili at the top, and this is where they produce all their spores. Now, this is a plant that you can't eat, at least as far as I know, but what is interesting about this plant is the spores that they produce are flammable. And so as a result, these spores have been used historically to create a flash in things like Victorian theater, but also when they did the old-time photography, when they have a pan and they would have the flash pan, when they would take those shots, it was Lycophyte spores that they would use to get that flash. So, currently right now I'm at Jam Pond, which is a bog that's about a little over an hour northwest of Oneonta. And the reason I'm here is to take a look at some sphagnum. Now, sphagnum is a type of moss, and moss is a bryophyte, and collectively the bryophytes are known as the non-vascular plants. But the reason I'm here to look at sphagnum is because you can't eat it, but it's a great example of a utilitarian plant, a plant that can be used. And the way in which sphagnum has been used is basically as a sponge. So sphagnum has amazing qualities at both the cellular level and also at the morphological level, the way that the plant is structured, that allows it to absorb and hold onto any liquid, really. So if I pick up this sphagnum I have in my hand right here and squeeze it, you'll see how much water comes out of this thing. It's incredible. So people have used this for centuries for things like padding in diapers. They've used it for bandages with bad wounds. In fact, during the World Wars, when they were running low on cotton, nurses went out and harvested sphagnum for making bandages. So it's really just an incredible plant. Again, anything that you need to absorb, like a sponge, get some sphagnum. So I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to edible and utilitarian plants of central New York. And I really encourage you to get out and learn more about the amazing plants that make up your local flora. Above all else, please make sure to be a good steward and always treat our natural areas with compassion and respect.